Snooker, a type of billiards immensely popular in the United Kingdom, drew widespread attention on May 5, 1980, when every fifth resident of the country tuned in to watch the final of the Snooker Championship. Suddenly, the broadcast was interrupted, and viewers witnessed something entirely unexpected. Figures in black masks storming a historic building in London. Several militants had seized the Iranian Embassy in London, taking 24 people hostage. Millions followed the unfolding drama in real time. The assault on May 5th became the concluding episode of a 6-day high-stakes saga. The main antagonists were the armed militants, ready to go to any lengths. Failure to meet their demands meant death for the hostages. The problem was that the British authorities were, under no circumstances, prepared to negotiate, and the British law enforcement agencies had never conducted such complex hostage rescue operations before. In this challenging situation were 26 hostages, men and women of various ages and nationalities. They spoke different languages, had varied professions, and diverse perspectives on life. Yet what unified them all was the desire to survive. None of the millions of people following the 6-day siege could foresee its outcome. Every second, every decision, every detail had the potential to drastically alter the course of events. How the militants managed to seize a diplomatic building in the capital of Britain, their motivations, what occurred inside and outside the captured building, and ultimately, how the unprecedented rescue operation concluded in its time. This is the story of the Iranian Embassy siege in London, which shocked the world. 6 days, 15 hours, and 30 minutes. This is how long the siege of the embassy in London lasted in the year 1980. Thanks to the fact that the event became a media sensation at the time, we can today reconstruct the events of each of the 6 days in great detail, sometimes even minute by minute. This story is a gripping thriller with elements of psychological drama, an extreme ordeal for all the participants: police, captors, journalists, politicians, and most notably, the hostages. Each reacted differently when faced with these unprecedented conditions. And, understandably so, no one knows how they will behave in a life-threatening situation until they find themselves in one. The Iranian Embassy in London is located nearly in the centre, in a quiet, peaceful area with a beautiful park nearby, complete with a palace. The diplomatic building is guarded by Constable Trevor Locke. He is 41, slightly overweight and affable, a typical policeman found in jokes, helping old ladies cross the street and rescuing cats from trees. Guarding the embassy was a mundane and monotonous job to the extreme, and Trevor Locke liked it that way. Just minutes before, the glass door of the building had opened, and Abbas Falahi, the embassy porter, appeared. He offered Locke a cup of hot, freshly brewed coffee. Police officers on duty are prohibited from accepting such gifts. Yet the rain was drizzling down, and the day, as usual, promised to be uneventful. Therefore, the security guard agreed. Trevor Locke sees a young man approaching the embassy doors. Another Iranian student coming for a visa, thought the constable. The young man is holding a dark object. Trevor Locke realizes it is a submachine gun. Almost at the same moment, shots are fired. The coffee cup falls, the door glass shatters from a bullet hit, and the police officer, staggering back, feels blood filling his eyes. Several armed individuals rush into the building, shout something in Arabic, and fire into the air. Trevor Locke manages to press the emergency button on his radio. A second later, a militant tears the device off the officer's jacket and orders him in English to stand against the wall. The officer realizes he is not injured. The blood on his face is due to shards of shattered glass. At the time the militants stormed the building, there were just over 30 people inside. Approximately half were staff of the Iranian diplomatic service, while the other half were representatives of various countries who had come to the embassy to resolve issues related to visas, permits, and other bureaucracy. Some visitors, upon hearing gunfire, begin jumping out of the building windows and thus save themselves. The situation is slightly less fortunate for Ghulam Afrouz, the head of the Iranian mission in the United Kingdom. He jumps from his office from a height of 6 meters and lands poorly. The ambassador breaks several ribs and suffers a concussion. Afrouz remains lying motionless in the embassy's backyard. until militants drag him back inside. There are now 26 hostages in the seized building. They are divided into groups, one for women, another for men Iranians, and a third for all other men, among whom are representatives of Britain, Syria, and Pakistan. The hostages are searched. Somehow the militants miss a small revolver hanging on Trevor Locke's belt under several layers of police uniform. The constable does not know if this is his chance or indeed a threat to his life. On one hand, he can use the revolver at the right moment. On the other hand, if the weapon is found, Trevor will likely be killed. About 20 minutes after the first shot, the police understand they are dealing with an unprecedented crisis. The Iranian Embassy has been seized, hostages are inside, but how many, who they are, and most importantly, what the militants want and what they are willing to do is unclear. Numerous police officers are deployed to the Iranian Embassy. Their actions are led by a high-ranking Scotland Yard officer, Albert Dillo. His main task is to establish contact with the militants and find out their demands. A negotiator approaches the embassy doors and loudly announces that he is a representative of the police and is ready to engage in dialogue. Soon, the face of a militant wrapped in a scarf appears from the window. He hands the negotiator a piece of paper. The text is in English. In this message, the captors first apologize for the events and state that this is a necessary measure. They identify themselves as representatives of the so-called Arabistan, a small region in Iran inhabited by an Arab minority. According to the terrorists, the current authorities are destroying their people, and the seizure of the embassy is a way to pressure the leadership of Iran. The message then lists three main demands: to release 91 representatives of the Arab minority who are imprisoned in Iran, to compel the country's authorities to recognize full rights for Arabs, and for the United Kingdom to provide an aircraft to transport the militants and hostages out of the country. If the demands are not met, the terrorists promise to kill the hostages and blow up the building. After searching the hostages, the militants remove their scarves, allowing their faces to be seen for the first time. They are 6 young Arab men, none of whom appear to be over 30, which is entirely true. The role of the terrorist leader is played by a person named Salim. This is his pseudonym. His real name is Tawfiq Ibrahim al-Rashidi, and he has a biography that is not typical for a terrorist. The story of his life provides a good explanation of the group's complex motives, intertwining geopolitics, the national question, personal revenge, and a bit of naivety. A year before the embassy seizure in 1979, a significant event occurred in the Middle East, which some historians deem one of the most important events of the 20th century. The Islamic Revolution took place in Iran. Often on the internet, this event is depicted with before and after photographs. Women without hijabs and in short skirts before the Islamic Revolution, and the exact opposite afterward. This is partially true, but the reality was much more complex. The last monarch of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, was a beloved despot of Western leaders in the Middle East. A modern leader ready for cooperation, rich from oil revenues. At the same time, Pahlavi was a harsh authoritarian ruler, suppressing dissent and political opponents. In a country where the majority nationality were Persians, Arabs were in the minority. They inhabited oil-rich regions in the southwest of Iran, but despite this, lived in worse conditions and had fewer rights and opportunities than Persians. Tawfiq al-Rashidi was fortunate. He was born into a well-off family for Iranian Arabs and managed to enroll in a prestigious institute in Tehran. The young man knew 4 languages and, like many students, showed interest in politics. Initially, he participated in demonstrations against monarch Pahlavi. After his overthrow, radical anti-Western theocrats, led by Ayatollah Khomeini, came to power in Iran. Iranian Arabs believed that the new government, as promised, would grant some autonomy to the region in the southwest of the country, which they called Arabistan. Khomeini had no intention of doing anything like that, and instead tightened control over the region. Now, the protests of Arabs were harshly suppressed by the new regime as well, with the number of dead protesters sometimes reaching several hundred. The brother of Tawfiq fell victim to the new regime, which became a trigger. An intelligent and educated young man transformed into a resistance fighter. He underwent training at a base in Iraq. On one hand, the country's leader, Saddam Hussein, sympathized with the Arabs. while on the other hand he sought to destabilize the situation in his adversary Iran's territory. Thus, he assisted in training militants and supplying them with weapons. With forged passports, Tawfiq and 5 accomplices made their way to London, where on April 30th they commenced their operation. Sim Harris and Chris Kramer were BBC employees who came to the Iranian Embassy to get visas. Now both were sitting on the floor of one of the offices at gunpoint. Once the initial shock subsided, Sim Harris noticed an interesting detail. The militants wore new fashionable clothes. Jeans and sneakers looked as if they had been purchased a couple of hours earlier in an expensive London store. And this wasn't far from the truth. The day before, the terrorists had been shopping lavishly, spending money provided by Iraqi organizers. The fact was, none of the terrorists planned on dying. Half of them, just like their leader Tawfiq, were well educated and had lost relatives in the fight against Khomeini's regime. The militants sincerely believed their mission to be noble and seriously expected that Britain and Iran would comply with their demands within a day, sparing them the need to kill anyone, allowing them to leave the country as heroes. This naive plan was not without precedent. In the 1970s, there were several hostage situations in Western countries that ended just so, with authorities conceding to the terrorists. What the militants who seized the embassy in London failed to account for was the current Prime Minister's personality. A year prior, Margaret Thatcher had taken office. The Prime Minister convened an emergency meeting regarding the Iranian embassy crisis. Thatcher was not yet referred to as the Iron Lady, but her reaction to the situation clearly indicated why she would earn that title. The Prime Minister's stance was clear and firm. Hostages must be freed, preferably peacefully and all of them, but there could be no question of allowing the militants to leave British territory. They committed a crime on British soil, and thus, on British soil, they must be defeated. Period. Scotland Yard officer Dillo faced a complex situation. In light of Thatcher's directives, the room for manoeuvre was minimal, the captor's demands were unfeasible, and the police lacked the expertise and resources to conduct a full-scale assault, so Dillo bought time. During negotiations with the militants, the police representative positioned himself merely as a liaison, claiming he couldn't decide anything himself and needed to relay everything to his superiors. This psychological ploy effectively bought more time, with all delays attributed to this supposed superior. The Iranian embassy was in a building adjacent to several others. People were evacuated from there, and the perimeter was guarded by armed police with dogs. Snipers occupied roofs of nearby buildings. Dillo decides that the assault will commence regardless if it is discovered that the terrorists have killed 2 hostages. Another issue at that moment is that the exact number of hostages, as well as their identities, is still unknown to the police. Meanwhile, tension inside the embassy is rising. Trevor Locke realizes that he needs to use the restroom. However, male hostages did this accompanied by militants with the door open. The police officer is aware that as soon as he removes his pants, the gun is likely to fall out. Considering that the captors have promised to kill the hostages if their demands are not met, their reaction to a concealed weapon is unpredictable. Therefore, Locke decides to almost entirely refrain from water and food and endure for as long as possible. BBC producer Chris Kramer still believes that everything will be resolved soon and the hostages will be freed. However, just in case, he does write a farewell note to his parents and places it in his pocket. The Iranian ambassador, Afrous, survived an unsuccessful jump from the window. However, several broken ribs and a mild concussion make themselves known. He sits semi-conscious on the floor. Next to the ambassador is Syed Lavasani. Officially, he is the assistant press attaché of the Iranian embassy, but in reality, a spy. His primary job was monitoring Iranian dissidents who fled the country and gathering information about Western countries' plans regarding Iran. Afrous, Lavasani, and several other hostages began working at the diplomatic mission and in the United Kingdom quite recently, immediately after the Islamic Revolution. They are ardent supporters of the current regime and Khomeini. This fact is crucial for understanding the dynamics of relations within the embassy. There are about 30 people present. Random visitors, embassy technical staff who started working there long before the Islamic Revolution and have varied attitudes towards it. Then devoted supporters of Ayatollah Khomeini, appointed to the embassy recently. And finally, militants, fierce enemies of the current Iranian regime. All these people with absolutely different values are in a very tense situation in a confined space. Despite the unprecedented nature of the situation and intense psychological pressure, most hostages remain calm during the first day, partly due to the militants' behavior. They act rather politely, especially towards women and men who are not Iranians. The terrorists apologize for the inconvenience, feed the hostages with food found in the embassy, and offer some basic medical supplies if necessary. One of the young embassy staff members fares the worst. She constantly cries and sometimes loses consciousness. Initially, the hostages demand that the police send a doctor. They refuse, as he could simply become another hostage. The female staff tell the militants that their colleague is unwell because she's pregnant. This is not true, but it nonetheless helps achieve results. Later in the evening, the terrorists release the female hostage. To the disappointment of the police, she remembers nothing of the events due to her nerves. She cannot provide any valuable information about the militants, their numbers, how they are armed, their plans, and so forth. Besides political differences, people in the embassy are also divided by a language barrier. The native language of the militants is Arabic. For the Iranians, it is Farsi, and for the British, it is English. Some of those present know several languages, but not perfectly. In this respect, one of the most valuable hostages becomes Mustafa Karkuti, a journalist of Syrian-British descent, who also found himself in the embassy building due to a visa issue. Thanks to his knowledge of Arabic and English, Karkuti acts as a link between the militants, hostages, and authorities. It is Karkuti, under threat of a gun, who assists the terrorists in communicating with the BBC editorial team. Hostages inform journalists about the purpose of the capture and their demands. Ambassador Afrouz communicates the same information to the Iranian foreign minister through a special phone line directly from the embassy. He also states that the terrorists promise to kill the hostages if the demands are not met. The reaction of the head of Iran's foreign department is predictable and categorical. He states that the whole operation is a planned CIA operation, which was not true, involving Iraq, which was true. The minister also declares that Iran does not intend to negotiate with terrorists, let alone fulfill their demands. All killed hostages, they assert, will be considered true martyrs, having given their lives for the Islamic Revolution. For the terrorists, the call does not yield results, but they are not greatly disappointed, as they seriously hope that the British authorities, including under media pressure, will negotiate with the Iranian authorities to meet the demands before the 24-hour ultimatum expires. The next day will be crucial. Late at night, 2 vans approach one of the buildings neighbouring the embassy. From them emerge 24 men in jeans, caps, and carrying large bags. They might have passed as a group of tourists if not for the time of day. These men are members of the Special Air Service, a covert military unit. By noon on Thursday, the militants' ultimatum expires. Prime Minister Thatcher's position remains the same. There can be no question of allowing the militants to leave the country, even if they release the hostages. The militants, in turn, do not plan to release anyone. On the contrary, they threaten to kill the hostages if the demands are not met. The terrorists reiterate this in an interview with BBC journalists, with whom they communicate on Thursday morning. For the militants, maximum media coverage of this incident is one of the main goals. It is a way to draw mass attention to the issues of the region, which few outside Iran have heard about. For Albert Dillo, who is overseeing police actions around the embassy, the militants' access to telephones within the building is a problem. Ideally, the law enforcement officers need to control all information coming in and out of the building. If the police are the militants' only means of communication with the outside world, it allows for much more effective negotiations. Therefore, Dillo decides to cut all the embassy's phone lines, completely depriving the militants of communication. Of course, the terrorists are informed that there was some problem with the communications. and thus in exchange, negotiators through a window provide them with a working phone. However, this phone can only connect to the police. Additionally, the new phone has a short cord, which means the terrorists will be forced to keep it on the ground floor. Consequently, part of the militants will also be concentrated on the ground floor near the device. This is an important detail in planning the assault. Using the new phone, Taufik informs the police that they will release another hostage. This is BBC producer Chris Kramer. During the night he had severe stomach pain, leading to diarrhea, and since then he continued to lie on the floor, giving the impression of a man at death's door. They gave him the tablets available to the militants, but they did not help. Eventually, 2 hostages carry the semi-lifeless Kramer out of the building and leave him on the sidewalk from where the police pick him up. In the ambulance, it becomes clear that the BBC producer truly feels unwell, but not critically so. He had intensely feigned his near-death condition throughout the previous night. Considering the previous hostage was released specifically due to health reasons, Kramer realized this was his chance. He would live a long life but would be haunted by the guilt of having used deception to escape the building alive. However, thanks to Kramer's relatively good health immediately after his release, he provides the police with significant information about what is happening inside the building. He reports the number of hostages and their conditions, that there are 6 militants, describes them, where they are located within the building, what weapons they use, that they have grenades, and that they spoke about more serious explosives, which Kramer had not seen. He also mentions that the guard, Trevor Locke, has a concealed revolver inside. Thursday morning also marks the moment when the hostage crisis at the embassy in London becomes global news. British and international journalists begin to converge on the scene. The last time such a number of press gathered was 30 years earlier at the coronation of Elizabeth II. Some media representatives arrive in trucks full of the latest equipment. Others erect small structures to shoot from a better vantage point. Some negotiate with nearby residents and film from their windows. The hostage crisis at the Iranian Embassy becomes one of the first media sensations to unfold in real time on television. 13 minutes remain until the deadline declared by the militants. The police negotiator informs the captors that the work on restoring the telephone lines is still underway, but it will require more time. In return, he suggests asking their superiors for permission to release a press statement with the terrorists' declarations and demands for the global media. Taufik agrees and extends the ultimatum by 2 hours. This is a small victory for the police. As recently as yesterday, the militant leader appeared unwavering in his determination to carry out his threats, and suddenly he retreats. Yes, it is far from a complete victory for the police, but it is certainly progress. BBC sound engineer and hostage Sim Harris began recording in his notebook what was happening inside the embassy almost from the beginning of the siege. His diary would survive despite the severe destruction of the building and provide much valuable information about the course of the siege from the hostages' perspective. Thus, at 12:30, Harris records one of the first disputes between the militants and the Iraqi supporters of Ayatollah Khomeini. First and foremost, this involves Ambassador Afrouz, who felt much better on the second day, and his press attaché, who is also an Iranian spy, Lavasani. The militant leader Taufik argues that Khomeini simply deceived the Arabs of Iran by not granting them the promised autonomy and rights. These words naturally provoke an angry reaction from the supporters of the current Iranian government. "The Imam is not lying," shouts Lavasani in response, to which Taufik and another militant named Yassim reply that they are ready to die for the freedom of Arabistan. These words certainly do not please the majority of hostages, among whom are technical staff of the embassy and visitors who happen to be there by chance, and they clearly are not ready to die for either side of the conflict. Another deadline has expired, and Taufik contacts the authorities by phone, stating that he is extending the deadline to 4:30 p.m., at which point they will certainly carry out their threats, and the police will be to blame. Soon after, he calls again and demands 25 hamburgers to be delivered within 5 minutes. Officer Dillo cannot help but notice that the situation is improving. The militants keep extending the ultimatum deadlines. They have already released 2 hostages, and now they are ordering food. 5 minutes later, the negotiator brings a tray of fast food to the embassy doors. It is important for the police that the people inside the embassy are fed, not only the hostages but also the captors, as hungry people are generally not very amenable to negotiation. The positive impact of simple carbohydrates soon becomes evident. At 4:45 p.m, the militants once again extend the deadline, this time by another 5 hours. As is tradition, they add that the hostages will be killed if the conditions are not met. But what is most interesting is the new demand. Now, among their demands is a plane at Heathrow Airport that will take the militants and the Iranian hostages to one of the Middle Eastern countries. The British will be released at the airport. To oversee the process, the terrorists demand the presence of the ambassadors of Iraq, Algeria, and Jordan. A bus with covered windows must be brought to the embassy building to transport the terrorists and hostages to the airport. Thus, the demands to release 90 Arab prisoners from Iranian jails were removed. Rumour has it that some of them were hurriedly executed immediately after the embassy was seized. Constable Trevor Locke was the only one who barely touched the delivered burgers, limiting himself to only a few pieces of French fries. He continues to conceal his revolver. Locke approaches Sim Harris and quietly whispers that, in his opinion, the militants are unlikely to be allowed to leave the country. The terrorist leader Taufik is convinced otherwise. Of course, at that moment he is unaware that, under Thatcher's directive, the militants are going nowhere, even if it requires protracted negotiations. The problem is that the Prime Minister's patience might have been infinite, but the patience of the captors certainly was not. Closer to 7 o'clock, when it becomes clear that the captors' demands are again unmet, the enraged leader Taufik throws the phone provided by the police out the window. By the evening of the second day, the psychological dynamics within the embassy noticeably change. The relationship between the militants and hostages significantly improves, at least with the majority of hostages who are not ardent supporters of Ayatollah Khomeini. Taufik frequently consults with journalist Karkuti or policeman Locke, asking for help if something needs translating into English, or their opinion on the likelihood of the police fulfilling the militants' demands. The female hostages sympathize with a captor named Fauzi Najad, the most polite of all the militants, always trying to assist the women if they need anything. Some hostages gradually question why the police are stalling, why they are not providing the militants with a bus or plane. Yes, the captors might be bad, but at least their demands from the very beginning are quite clear and explicit, unlike the police's behaviour, which involves some complex and obscure game and deception. At night, several Secret Service officers climb onto the roof of the Iranian Embassy, conducting reconnaissance of the area. Before this, during the day, the Secret Service leadership developed Operation Nimrod in the basement of a nearby building. The military had several assault scenarios. According to one, the hostages would be freed from a bus en route to the airport, at the airport itself, or even immediately at the embassy. The second scenario involved assaulting the building itself. There were also variations here. One involved a direct, harsh entry through windows and doors, while another involved special service personnel descending on ropes from the roof. As one of the unit leaders expressed it, operations for freeing hostages never go as planned, simply because the opposing side also has its plans. According to Secret Service calculations, different assault scenarios gave varied chances of success. The lowest odds were 5%, the highest 40%. Not particularly impressive figures. The upcoming assault turned out to be an extremely risky endeavour for another reason. This Secret Service unit was an elite division created during the Second World War. For the last 10 years, they have been actively involved in areas related to terrorism. However, all situations involving hostage-taking in the history of this special service had concluded before they intervened. That is, they planned the siege in every detail, but it never came to fruition. Therefore, the siege of the Iranian Embassy might become their first real mission. Sim Harris accidentally noticed at night how several militants were washing underwear. The man took this positively, People concerned about the cleanliness of their underwear are unlikely planning to die. Within a few minutes, Harris's mood changed drastically. Tawfiq announced to the Iranians that the militants intended to kill one of them. According to the leader, he wanted to teach the police a lesson. The terrorist gave the Iranians the right to choose the victim themselves, giving them 40 minutes. Trevor Locke felt the weight of the revolver at his belt, pondering if he could use it at the right moment. The question was not so much technical as moral, for by the third day of the embassy siege, it was clear that many hostages were experiencing symptoms of a known condition. 7 years prior, criminals had seized a bank building in the capital of Sweden. Their hostages included several employees of the institution. The crisis lasted 6 days, after which the police attacked the building and the captors surrendered. But during the days spent together with the criminals, something strange occurred. The hostages began to develop sympathy for the captors. According to some reports, one of the women even developed romantic feelings for a criminal. The phenomenon became known as the Stockholm Syndrome. The 40-minute ultimatum expired. During this time, one of the Iranian hostages had a heart attack and lay in a semi-conscious state on the floor. However, the militants had not yet carried out their threat of murder. A BBC correspondent and a negotiator approached the embassy window. The militants demanded the presence of a journalist, as they now had an additional requirement, a broadcast of their statement on the BBC. These negotiations become a critical turning point. Now, the terrorist leader Tawfiq hides behind the curtain, while the faces of hostages Harris and Karkuti appear from the window. Moreover, the victims are not merely relaying the militants' statements and demands, they insist on their fulfillment themselves. The hostages genuinely do not understand why the authorities are delaying and doing nothing. Researchers of Stockholm Syndrome explain it as the moment the hostages' psychology shifts. They begin to identify with the captors, as the police outside appear to be playing against them. They delay actions, they do not meet demands, and they give evasive answers. Furthermore, the hostages gradually realize that their rescue primarily depends on the terrorists. Thus, they begin to perceive them as protectors. At the same time, the militants experience a situation mirroring Stockholm Syndrome. They develop a certain attachment to the hostages. This phenomenon would later be called the Lima Syndrome after a takeover in the capital of Peru. This partly explains why the militants are not yet carrying out their threats of murder. At least for now. It has been 20 minutes since the police provided the militants with a new phone as a replacement for the one discarded by Tawfiq. This device also allowed communication only with the police. Additionally, a bug was installed inside it, enabling law enforcement to listen to conversations within a few meters nearby. Trevor Locke and Sim Harris are called by the leader of the militants. In one of the embassy offices, Tawfiq stands next to a wall, listening intently. From inside, a creaking sound is heard. The militant states that, in his opinion, the police are preparing for an assault. Trevor Locke knocks on the wall several times and the sound stops. The building is very old, perhaps mice, he says. However, both he and Sim Harris understand perfectly well that this is not a very skillful lie. The source of the noise was almost certainly a drill. Tawfiq sends Locke to find out from the negotiator if the police are indeed preparing for an assault. The representative of the authorities replies in the negative, and for him this is the absolute truth. The negotiators did not know that the police and the MI5 Secret Service were drilling holes in the walls to install listening devices and even mini-cameras. Efforts that, unfortunately, so far have not yielded results, as the quality of the images and even the audio were very poor, just like the bug on the phone. The negotiators also did not know that the Special Service had hired an architect who created small models of each floor of the building so that the military would know the location of the future operation precisely. Moreover, the Special Service erected an exact replica of the building on a 2/3 scale at the base for the personnel to practice the assault in maximally realistic conditions. In short, the negotiators were not let in on most of the police's plans, and there was a good reason for that. The less they know, the less chance there is of accidentally giving away valuable information in conversation with the militants. Hostages Harris, Locke and Carcott realize that Tawfiq's patience may run out, leading to bloodshed. They decide to talk to the leader of the militants. Firstly, the hostages argue that diplomacy in Britain is always slow, and that rash decisions leading to irreversible consequences should not be made. Secondly, the hostages subtly hint at the possibility of the militants surrendering. Allegedly, the authorities might quickly exchange or release them. As an argument, they cite the attempted hijacking of a plane by Palestinian militants in 1970. Then, the terrorist was exchanged just a month after the incident. The leader of the militants responds that surrender is not being considered, as it would mean capitulation. After sunset, people inside the Iranian Embassy hear loud noises coming from the street. From the window, they see employees of a gas company drilling the road surface. No scheduled work in this area of London, of course, was planned. With loud noises from workers, Scotland Yard officer Dillo decides to distract those in the embassy from the police's attempt to install a bug in the building's walls. That same evening, Tawfiq and journalist Karkuti, whom the militant leader found to be an interesting conversationalist, engage in a long discussion about Middle Eastern history and politics. During the dialogue, the terrorist reveals to the hostage the name of the true organizer of the attack on the Iranian embassy. It turns out to be a man named Abu Nidal. He lived in Iraq, was under the patronage of Saddam Hussein, and engaged in freelance terrorism around the world. The United States Department of Defense considered Nidal's group to be the most dangerous terrorist organization in existence. Trevor Locke, like many other hostages, wakes up to loud snoring. Its source is a man named Nawabzada Gul. He can officially be considered the most accidental of all the hostages. Gul was a tourist who ended up in the building simply because he needed a place to sit and spend some time. For several days, he seriously attempted to persuade the terrorists to release him because he had a plane ticket and could miss his flight. This argument didn't impress the militants, so Gul continued to disturb everyone nightly with his loud snoring. Only on the fourth day of the siege did the police manage to obtain photographs of the militants. Based on statements from released hostage Chris Kramer, composites were created and sent to the British Embassy in Iran to compare them with photographs of visa applicants. The names given by the militants in their applications, of course, turned out to be false, but now the police at least had real photographs. This was a very important aspect for the future assault. SAS personnel would have to quickly separate the hostages from the terrorists under extreme conditions. Officially, all hostages were equal in their right to be freed. Unofficially, the SAS had clear priorities. They decided whom they would rescue first and whom second. First on the list was Trevor Locke, a Briton and law enforcement officer. Second were all other Britons. Third were citizens of other countries. Finally, if any of the militants survived, they would be arrested. A BBC correspondent finally approached the embassy, brought at the demand of the terrorists. Their main question was why their statement had not yet been broadcast. The negotiations on the terrorists' side were conducted by captured BBC sound engineer Sim Harris. He literally shouted at his colleague from the window, not understanding why they were still stalling, to which the colleague responded with something vague, implying a misunderstanding. In truth, the BBC understood everything perfectly. The authorities simply had no desire to broadcast the terrorists' statement nationwide. However, realizing that such a broadcast could be bargained for the release of some hostages, the police contacted the captors. They wanted the release of 2 people. After some consideration, the terrorists agreed. The militants and hostages gather around the radio receiver. The BBC announcer states that they are compelled to interrupt the broadcast for an important announcement. Then, word for word, he reads the statement from the terrorists. Tawfiq, his accomplices, and even the hostages are pleased. To them, it feels like a collective victory. Shortly before the 9 o'clock news, Tawfiq, as promised, released one of the hostages. This was a young secretary, from the embassy named Kanji. After the militant leader heard the broadcast, he was ready to release a second hostage. To the great surprise of many, the next release was Nawabzada Gul, the same unexpected visitor to the embassy, and the final reason for this decision was Gul's impossibly loud snoring, which annoyed hostages and militants alike. Afterwards, Tawfik contacts the police and demands food from the best Persian restaurant in London. That evening, there is a real feast in the embassy. Sound engineer Sim Harris notes in his diary that he goes to bed in good spirits. He thinks that everything will end tomorrow, and they'll go home alive. Alas, neither would prove to be true. On Sunday morning, the atmosphere at the embassy is optimistic. After the previous day's broadcast and delicious dinner, many awoke in a good mood. The terrorists even allow the hostages to wash for the first time in 5 days. Constable Locke feels that he carries an unpleasant odour. He has not removed several layers of clothing all these days, out of fear of revealing his revolver. Washing without undressing is difficult, so the policeman politely declines the offer. Instead, Locke requests one of the militants to escort him to the restroom. There he explains he has a severe intestinal issue and would appreciate being allowed to close the door for this exception. He is permitted. Thus, on the 5th day after the abduction, what could be considered the most heroic constipation in history concludes. The first half of Sunday is uneventful. British authorities meet with ambassadors from several Middle Eastern countries whose presence the captors demanded. The diplomatic representatives propose their options for resolving the situation. Among the options is offering the militants a plane to leave the country. The British authorities make it clear that this will not happen. In response, the ambassadors do not wish to participate merely by conveying messages from one side to the other. Furthermore, they clearly understand that the events in the embassy are a proxy war between Iran and Iraq, which no one wants to interfere in. Consequently, the discussions with Middle Eastern diplomats end in nothing. In the second half of the day, the militants write various derogatory words on the walls against the current Iranian leadership, including in Farsi. Thus, embassy staff can read the phrase, "Death to Khomeini." Iran's ambassador, Afrus, begins yelling at the militants. The most aggressive of the terrorists, named Yassin, yells back and pushes Afrus. Another militant brandishes a grenade as a threat. An Iranian embassy staff member and spy, Lavasani, joins the argument. He is shouting so loudly that it's impossible to make out the words. Journalist Karkuti and other hostages try to calm the situation. The police can hear everything happening clearly. Their bugs, installed in the walls, are now yielding results. Next, they hear the voice of the militants' leader, Tawfik, who calls journalist Karkuti into a separate room. At this moment, many hostages believe that Tawfik has taken Karkuti away to kill him. Why he chose Karkuti specifically is not entirely clear, since the two men had established a good relationship. Finally, to everyone's amazement, the terrorist leader decides to release Mustafa Karkuti. Immediately after his release, the police interrogate the hostage. He provides a lot of important information about what is happening inside the embassy. The SAS personnel study all this data carefully. They make the final decision that the assault will take place in the building, not in a bus or at the airport. Therefore, the hostages' testimony about the militants' armament and their location in the building is extremely important. At night, SAS staff finalize the plan. The decision is made that the assault will begin in the evening. The militants will then think that the day is coming to an end and that nothing serious will happen anymore. In short, they will be less vigilant. The entire operation will take only a few minutes. Its success will depend on preparation, discipline, and, not least, luck. Lack of sleep has a destructive effect on the human body and mind. Irritability, hallucinations, inability to make decisions, weakness, and mood swings. Many intelligence agencies around the world have long begun using sleep deprivation as an effective torture method. Since the very start of the takeover, the terrorist leader Tawfik has slept for a total of 5 hours. All this under extreme tension. By Monday, the lack of sleep affects him so much that Tawfik struggles to formulate simple thoughts. The terrorist leader calls Trevor Locke and Sim Harris to the wall where militants wrote offensive statements. Since that happened, the inward bulge of the wall became evident. The point is, this was the area where the embassy bordered the neighbouring building. Tawfiq is convinced that the police are preparing an assault, including plans to demolish the wall. In general, the terrorist leader is right. The SAS have indeed almost dismantled the wall from the side of the neighbouring building, assuming it would be one of the assault directions. They later abandoned this idea. At this moment, the final plan for Operation Nimrod is already agreed upon, and the SAS personnel are making the last preparations for the assault. 30 people will participate in the operation. Nimrod will start with an explosion. Charges are set on the roof and the second-floor balcony. The force must be sufficient to completely disorient those inside, but not so great as to totally destroy the building. Then, the soldiers throw smoke grenades, and 36 people, divided into several groups, storm the building from different directions. One group from the inner courtyard, another through the second-floor balcony above the main entrance. The remaining groups infiltrate the building from the roof using fire ladders or ropes. The SAS soldiers carefully memorize the layout of the rooms inside, as well as photographs of the militants and hostages. They will have to decide in split seconds whether to shoot a person or not. All this under conditions of poor visibility due to the smoke bombs. The leader of the SAS unit gives clear instructions to his subordinates that their main goal is the rescue of the hostages, preserving the lives of the militants if possible. However, if an SAS operative feels the slightest threat from a terrorist, he must fire immediately. After another round of negotiations with the police, in which no clear responses were given to the militants' demands, the terrorists lead the Arab press attaché and spy Sayed Lavasani into a separate room. For about 30 minutes, there is no news from him. Then the hostages hear several gunshots. Then Tawfiq appears and says that Lavasani has been killed, and now this will happen every 40 minutes. The terrorists will kill one person at a time until the authorities meet all their demands. The police also notice the shots, thanks to the wiretap. The SAS operation is not yet ready, so they need to buy time, and do this in a way that the remaining hostages do not suffer. The Minister of the Interior writes a letter to the militants. However, the message contains nothing but vague wording. No answers to the terrorists' demands. The Briton Ron Morris, who worked as a steward at the Iranian Embassy and found himself among the hostages, tells the policeman Locke that he believes the police will start the assault today, so it might be wise not to take off their shoes just in case. Trevor Locke at that moment is fingering his revolver. Perhaps it's time to use it, he thinks. The police operatives responsible for the wiretap catch a conversation between two militants in Arabic. "We must do something before dawn," says the first. "We need to kill 2 or 3 hostages," answers the second. "No, by 10 in the morning we'll kill everyone," says the first. 10 minutes later, the SAS unit commander gives the signal that they are in a state of full readiness and are waiting for the command to start Operation Nimrod. The building of the Iranian Embassy is shaken by a deafening explosion. Operation Nimrod will take the next few minutes. All this is broadcast live on television channels. Millions of viewers have never seen anything more impressive in their lives. First, one of the SAS groups descends from the roof on ropes to the second-floor balcony from the side of the backyard. One of the soldiers' ropes gets tangled, and he hangs over the window opening from which flames erupt after the explosion. He shouts to his colleagues above to cut the rope. Afterwards, they fall onto the balcony, and the group storms inside. Several military personnel jump into the building through the glass roof, which had been blown up moments earlier. Others burst into the building through the rear entrance. Inside, everything is filled with thick, acrid smoke. Tawfiq stands by the phone. The police were distracting him with negotiations at the moment of the explosion. The militant leader drops the receiver and runs into the corridor. There stands Trevor Locke. For a few moments, the men look at each other. This is enough for the symptoms of Stockholm Syndrome in the hostages to completely dissipate. Locke forcefully pushes Tawfiq into the doorway. He falls to the floor, dropping the pistol from his hands, and Locke, with his hefty 100-kilogram body, pins him down, preventing him from moving. The police officer feels the revolver on his waist. For a week, the man on the floor threatened the hostages with murder. Finally, using his revolver would have been quite understandable. However, Trevor Locke decides not to do so. He continues to hold Tawfiq on the floor. Gunshots and screams are heard throughout the building. Many hostages try to hide under tables or just huddle in a corner. Sim Harris jumps onto the balcony from a burning room. Television cameras cannot show what is happening inside. Yet a few minutes later, viewers see hostages being led out of the building, many of whom lie down on the ground. From there, they are taken to ambulances. 10 minutes later, Operation Nimrod is officially concluded. The SAS managed to save all the hostages except for one. An Iranian embassy medic was killed by a terrorist during the assault. Several hostages and one SAS officer sustained minor injuries. The only surviving militant was Fauzi Najad. After SAS personnel entered the room where Trevor Locke was restraining the militant leader, he loosened his grip and left the building with the other hostages. At this moment, Tawfik attempted to grab a pistol and was killed by an SAS officer. The remaining terrorists were also neutralized, as they offered active resistance. As one of the soldiers who participated in Operation Nimrod later admitted, such an outcome was a great stroke of luck. Any detail, like the operation starting 5 seconds earlier or later, could have drastically changed the outcome for the worse. Yes, we were lucky, an officer would say, but luck has to be earned. The only surviving militant, Fauzi Najad, was sentenced to life imprisonment. He was released on parole after 27 years and remained in Britain. Police officer Trevor Locke received recognition for his bravery. He rarely gave interviews and after the incident transferred to the traffic police outside the city, where he watched passing cars until his retirement. In his spare time, Locke raised pigeons. Many hostages lived to the present day, or passed away recently, meeting annually on the anniversary of the embassy siege. This half-forgotten event today actually had a significant impact not only on the lives of those involved, but also on the world as a whole. In the same year, 1980, the Iran-Iraq War began, and one might say that the hostage-taking in London was in some way a precursor to this conflict. Echoes of the hostage-taking can be found in numerous Middle Eastern conflicts that continue to this day. For Margaret Thatcher, this event was in some respects the first opportunity to showcase the character of the future Iron Lady. It is hard to say what her reaction would have been during the famous Falklands War or other events, if not for the hostage rescue operation, which was, of course, considered a huge success, including by Thatcher herself. In 1980, the hostage-taking in London shocked the world. For most Britons, it was an event of the kind, where were you when it happened? Today, even in Britain, not everyone knows what happened on May 5, 1980, let alone the rest of the world. Why have many forgotten about this event? There are probably several answers to this question, but unfortunately the main one likely is that over the past 40 years, humanity has witnessed far more frightening things.